The Snowy River, an iconic Victorian alpine region which is home to a vast array of wildlife and in some places is the last natural habitat for some vulnerable and endangered native species. If you love the outdoors, cooking over an open fire, soaking in the sounds and smell of nature, and being surrounded by wildlife, then there's no better way to enjoy all of that than through camping. Yes, I can hear some of you say, that's all well and good, Val. You can indulge in a whole heap of food and get lots of R&R, but where are you going with all of this? Well, this was a turning point for me. I was keen to squeeze in some wildlife photography, but it wasn't until I got home that I started to notice some things about the sharpness of my photos, or lack thereof. Some were tack sharp, some were acceptable, and a lot were just rubbish. I thought about it a fair bit, and a lot has happened since then. And today, I want to share with you some of my thoughts and tips on taking sharp wildlife photos. Hello there, welcome back to the channel. It has been such a long time since I've made a video. I hope you've all been keeping well, and I've really missed the interaction with so many of you, so it's really good to be back. I thought I'd quickly just give you a rundown of what I've been up to, and I suppose what my mindset has been like over this period of time. My trip to the Snowy River was many months ago now, and a lot of things have happened since then. Unfortunately, work for me has been all-consuming. My day job has just been absolutely relentless, and I've had various other distractions and noise in life, and I've been stretched quite thin and pulled in all different directions. So unfortunately, I really haven't had much of a chance to get out for decent photography shoots. On the rare occasions that I was able to sneak out for some shutter therapy, they were close to home where bird life was much more abundant than sweeping vistas of landscapes. So over the past few months, I've pretty much just been virtually doing birding and very little else by way of photography. And it has been quite a revelation. Many of you will know that I love landscape, wildlife and nature photography in equal spades, but I've come to realize just how much I do enjoy and love wildlife photography. I love animals generally, but to be able to be in their habitat, in their natural environment, to observe their interactions, their behaviors, their individual personalities and expressions. It just has been so captivating and so fascinating. And I really do appreciate the diversity of life out there beyond humans. So I've decided that I do want to focus more on wildlife photography. Don't get me wrong, I still will do a fair bit of landscape photography, but I think with the slight pivot in my focus and direction, it has made sense for me to switch camera systems. And mainly because I've come to realize that I haven't been fully satisfied with the sharpness of my photos and the low light performance of my camera. So I've long been a believer, a very firm believer, that the gear that you use is secondary to your skills and your passions as a photographer. But I think particularly for wildlife photography, the quality of the gear that you use and its ability to actually perform and do what you need it to do is quite crucial. So for that reason, Fujifilm is no longer my main camera system. I've still got my X-T4. I'll never part with that. That's my original first love. But I have been very fortunate to have been able to pick up a Canon R5, which is now part of my camera setup. I got this at an amazing price. It's a refurbished model, but effectively 100% brand new. And if I wasn't able to get it for the fantastic price that I did get it for, I don't think it'd be in my hands right now, and I'd still be hanging out for the R5 Mark II, which, if all the rumors out there are correct, should be released in February next year. So I'll be keeping a very keen eye out for that. And I was also able to pick up the RF 100 to 500mm lens. This is not a cheap lens, but a fantastic lens and really versatile. So I've been super rapt with the images that I've been able to take with that lens. And this is definitely not a gear review video. I might do a video in future sharing my thoughts on my new setup. But what I really wanted to cover in today's video is that it doesn't start and end with the gear that you have. Now, we all have different budgets and priorities, and regardless of whatever gear you have, we all want sharper wildlife photos. So the question really is, what can we do to make sure that we take the sharpest photos that we can with the gear that we have? Now, my thoughts in today's video, I think, apply generally to wildlife photography, but because I've been doing a lot of birding over the past few months, there is obviously quite a lean towards that. So look, without further ado, let's get straight into it. We all know that in photography, light is king. And here I'm not so much referring to the quality of the light, but more so to the quantity of the light. The more light that hits your camera sensor, the easier and quicker it will be for your camera's autofocus system to find focus. And the greater the likelihood that you can shoot at high shutter speeds and lower ISO. So ordinarily, if you find yourself with great ambient light, then you'd expect that your photos would be a lot sharper than if they were taken in poorer, low light conditions. But your ability to maximize the opportunity to take sharp photos with the great light that you have does require you to understand your light source and where you are positioned and where your subject is positioned and how it's moving relative to that light source. Otherwise, your image might be no sharper than if you were to take it in a rainforest on an overcast day. Always aim to have the sun at your back, and this should put you in the best possible position to capture your subject in maximum light. So while bright sunny conditions can be fantastic to get sharper photos, they're not always ideal because when the sun's high in the sky, it can create really harsh shadows, which can be unpleasant. It can create heat haze, and for most of the time, animals just aren't as active in the middle of the day. So unfortunately, we don't always get the ambient light that we'd like or hope for. And we also know that the quality of the light is often best at dawn or dusk. During these times, it tends to be still quite soft and subdued and can take on an array of beautiful hues to light the subject and the landscape. And also during these times, the light tends to be very dynamic and it can create for some gorgeous colors and some really interesting atmospheres. So we are encouraged as much as possible to shoot during these times, but of course there often isn't much ambient light. And so what can we do if we find ourselves in these situations to maximize the sharpness of our photos? Getting your shutter speed right is important. Too slow a shutter speed and you risk a blurry image. Too fast a shutter speed and with insufficient ambient lighting, then to make sure that you do have the correct exposure, you'll likely have to open up your aperture or ramp up your ISO. So is there an ideal shutter speed? Well, I guess that all depends on the circumstances that you're in and what your preferences are about how much you want to freeze that motion. Of course, there are general guidelines. So for example, to minimize motion blur, there is a default safe rule of 1 over your focal length. So if you're shooting at 500mm, that'd be 1/500th of a second. But to be honest, I think that rule is actually quite redundant these days, particularly with the advancements in stabilization systems in cameras and lenses. So in-body image stabilization in cameras and optical image stabilization in lenses. Some are just fantastic these days, so you can afford to shoot at a much lower shutter speed. But of course, if you find that you don't have the sturdiest of hands like me sometimes, you may want to think about increasing your shutter speed to compensate and minimize any motion blur. For birds in flight, I found that for medium-sized and larger-sized birds like pelicans and soaring raptors, I generally don't need any faster than 1/2000th of a second. For smaller birds, I've used shutter speeds upwards of 1/3000th of a second. But of course, this all depends on how much light you do or don't have. So while shutter speed is an important factor for image sharpness, you can't ignore how it interacts with the other elements in the exposure triangle. So if you find yourself in a situation where there's very low light and you're shooting at too high a shutter speed and you can't open your aperture any wider, then chances are you are shooting at a fairly high ISO. Now, with all the great denoising software out there these days, you might say, hey, not a problem, I can deal with it in post. And for the most part, you can. But sometimes if you push your ISO far too high, then you will compromise image sharpness. There is going to be a degradation in image quality. There will be a loss of details, contrast, and colors. And sometimes it may be too great for you to actually do anything about it in post. So while you shouldn't be afraid of using high ISO, you should manage your expectations and just be aware that sometimes if you push it far too high, then you will compromise image sharpness. Now, ISO performance will vary from camera to camera, and it pays to understand what the ISO threshold of your camera is, beyond which image quality may be compromised. There are two aspects to aperture here. The first relates to general frame sharpness and the second relates to depth of field sharpness. I think it really helps for you to understand the aperture at which your lens is sharpest at any given focal length. Now, for most cameras, if you shoot at the maximum aperture, so you shoot wide open, then generally the images tend to be softer than if you were to stop down, say, 1 or 2 stops. Now, how much you actually need to stop down will depend on your particular lens. So for example, on my 100 to 500, I know that it generally is very sharp, wide open throughout the focal length. But if I do stop down, I can improve sharpness a little bit and more so at the edges or at the corners. And that's going to be the case with most lenses. They'll generally be much sharper at the center of the frame and softer at the edges or at the corners. There's also another benefit to stopping down, and that's increasing the depth of field. So the closer the subject is in proximity to you, or the more of the frame that it fills, then generally the depth of field will be much shallower, and you'll find that you'll need to use a smaller aperture to ensure that most of your subject is acceptably sharp. But of course, that depends on your artistic preferences, and it does also come at a cost. Smaller aperture means that there's less light hitting your sensor, and there's also an increased risk of diffraction. Most cameras nowadays have very good IBIS, and lenses can have very good OIS, so make sure you turn these settings on. But also pay attention to the settings so it's not a set and forget, because some of these settings may not be suited to what you're doing in the particular circumstance. For example, setting 1 on this lens will stabilize both the horizontal and vertical axis, which counters my movement as I pan, which isn't what I want. Rather, I just need the vertical axis stabilized as I pan. From a physical standpoint, having your camera mounted on a tripod or a monopod definitely does help, but I do find that I prefer to shoot handheld most of the time because I love that flexibility and it allows me to respond to bird or animal action pretty quickly. So making sure that I am as stable as I can be is really important. I usually try to posture myself like a human tripod. If I'm standing, my legs are about shoulder width apart and I might try to find something to rest on. If I'm shooting from my car, I'll use the car window or the car door. If I'm crouching, I try to create as many physical contact points as possible between my body and the ground. That might be me having one knee or shin on the ground, and usually my elbows are tucked in. I also find that I tend to hold my breath during a burst of shots. Whether I do that subconsciously or consciously, I'm not quite sure. Set your focus to maximize your chances of getting a sharp shot. For wildlife, I always have my autofocus mode in continuous. That's Servo AF on Canon and AFC on most other camera brands. For birds, I usually have my AF method set to Spot AF for stationary or slow moving subjects and set to Zone for birds in flight. Now, if you have subject tracking in your camera, make sure you adjust your tracking sensitivity as needed to allow your AF to better lock focus and to stick to your subjects better depending on the circumstances you're in. So don't forget, if you've got a focus range limiter on your lens, remember to turn that on, especially if you know that your subject is going to be a minimum distance away from you. When you lose focus, it really helps with that limiter on because it allows your camera to find focus much more quickly by not wasting time hunting back and forth for your subject. Having said all of that, don't forget that there are a number of other factors that can impact on image sharpness. So for example, if you're using an extender, whether that's a 1.4 times or a 2 times extender, chances are there's going to be some impact on image sharpness. And also be mindful of the conditions that you're shooting in, as these can also impact the sharpness of your photos. Now, if you find yourself shooting in misty, foggy conditions or on a sunny day shooting in heat haze, well then yes, there's going to be some impact on image sharpness. Heat haze can cause light to refract and bend differently, and this can cause optical distortions, especially if you are far away from your subject. And finally, practice, practice, practice. The more that you get out there and take photos and put your skills and learnings to practice, the better you're going to get at taking sharp photos. And I think this is one of the best ways to improve critical skills like your panning skills or your hand-eye coordination or your ability to read, understand, and anticipate bird or animal actions and behaviors. For me, this is one of the best things about bird and wildlife photography. The opportunity to be out there, immerse myself in the environment, to observe, to learn, to appreciate. And so whether or not your photos are sharp is an important consideration, but it definitely isn't the be all and end all. So I hope you keep getting out there, keep enjoying your photography and take that shot. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.